We were told nothing about the treatment. All we knew is that he was going to be put to sleep for 3 weeks and it was just going to give his brain a rest, and that's all we knew. We didn't know about drugs, we didn't know about electric shock treatment, we knew nothing.
These lives have been wrecked, and not only that, they were fraudulently told that they were suffering from a mental illness when in fact they were suffering the damage from a very dangerous and unorthodox treatment.
I think they were just using forms of experimentation. Well, they really didn't know what they were doing. There was no real overseas evidence that what they were doing would be successful, and they were just playing games with people's lives.
This is the story of one of the darkest episodes in the history of psychiatry. It's a story of medical experimentation and fraud which led to the suffering of hundreds of innocent, vulnerable people over a period of 15 years. It's also a story of official incompetence and cover-up which enabled such a scandal to continue for so long without anything being done to stop it. This story of horror unfolded in the most unlikely setting of a quiet, leafy suburb in Sydney, Australia. Pennant Hills, 15 miles from the centre of Sydney, location for a small private hospital called Chelmsford. Typical of a kind of small-scale local facility in which a private psychiatrist would place a patient for observation or a short period of treatment, because although Australia has a national health service, there's also a tradition of patients being referred by their GPs to private specialist doctors, often paid for by health insurance. In the 60s and 70s, hundreds of people suffering from mental distress came to Chelmsford to get help. Barry Hart was a model and actor with a promising career ahead of him, but in 1973 he had an eye operation which was bungled by the surgeon, and Hart became depressed by the results. So he was referred by his doctor to a psychiatrist, Dr. John Heron. Dr. Heron advised him to take a few days' rest in the hospital under his supervision. So Barry Hart caught a cab to Chelmsford.
Well, I remember walking in to the ward. I was very nervous, and I saw a man in a bed sitting right here, and he had all his head was shaved. He had all scars over his scalp, and I thought, and he actually looked like something from a concentration camp. And I looked away quickly and across the ward, and there was a man in a bed here. Or when I say a man, he was only looked about 19 or 18, and he was very pale. In fact, his face was almost the colour of the pillow. And all his hair was lank, and he looked like he was like a rag doll. And he looked like he was completely drugged and like a rag doll. And I started to feel very uneasy because when I came through the entrance, they asked me to sign a form which gave permission to give shock treatment, which I refused to sign. And I thought, Christ, what's this place? And the nurse came up to me and he said, "Do you feel nervous?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Well, take this, it'll settle you down." And I thought it was something like a Valium or something. I don't know. So on that faith, I took this tablet, and that's the last thing I can remember. I remember her voice seemed to trail off, and someone saying, "You shouldn't be doing that." I don't know what that was, and The next thing I can remember was that everything was completely black. It was if I had no body, but I had a mind, and I couldn't feel anything. It was like, and there was two beams of white light, and they were coming across and meeting in the middle of my head, and then exploding. Next thing I remember, I had these tremendous pains in my shoulders, and I couldn't stop the ache and the pain, and I tried to move my arms to alleviate the pain, and my arms were strapped, and I went berserk. I could get these things off of me, and I remember screaming, and then everything went black again, and I remember people screaming and voices, and I remember a girl saying, "Pray for me," and I remember praying in this darkened place. And there was this Chinese wardsman sitting alongside the bed. And I asked him what day it was, and the day he said made no sense. And I told him I had these tremendous pains in my chest, and he said, "Oh, you've been sedated for 2 weeks." And then I started vomiting blood, and my legs started to swell, and the pain was excruciating. It was like someone had a knife and was twisting it into your ribs. I was shipped up to Hornsby Hospital, where I spent 2 weeks in Hornsby with double pneumonia, pleurisy, deep vein thrombosis, a pulmonary embolism, and anoxic-type brain damage.
Barry Hart's treatment at Chelmsford, from which he nearly died, was called deep sleep.
Deep sleep treatment, lasting between 1 and 3 months. Every available method is used here, all at the same time. A large dose of Largactil, a tranquilizing drug, and a smaller dose of sedatives. Drugs of the Nardil group for phobias, and of the tricyclic group for depression. In addition, up to 20 electric shocks.
This was St Thomas's Hospital in London in the 1960s, where, in contrast, the treatment was being safely practiced by its leading advocate, Dr. William Sargent. The central figure in this story, Dr. Harry Bailey, was a powerful and dynamic Sydney psychiatrist who visited London in the late 50s and was impressed by Dr. Sargent and his techniques. Bailey was the kind of doctor who glossed over his lack of experience with skillful name-dropping and showbiz flair. In spite of his lack of relevant qualifications, in the early 60s he persuaded the government to put £1 million into a new brain research unit with Bailey as director. Then in 1963, Bailey reverted to private practice and began using his own form of deep sleep treatment, adapted from Dr. Sargent's techniques, using Chelmsford Hospital for his patients.
Dr. Bailey saw it very much as his own hospital, although he had no financial interest in it. And he saw his cures as being the great answer to just about every mental illness. And with the force of his personality, he gathered round him people who did believe in him, both medical people and nursing staff, but also a large personal following of patients. And he was a very high-profile, very public figure. And without that sort of personality, the type of thing which happened at Chelmsford would not have happened. For it to have happened, you had to have a person in control there in whom other people really believed.
Dr. John Heron was a staunch believer in Bailey. Almost from the beginning of Bailey's regime at Chelmsford, Dr. Heron was closely involved as his deputy. During the 70s, Dr. Ian Gardner was contracted by Dr. Heron to administer electric shock treatment at Chelmsford. Dr. John Gill was part owner of Chelmsford. He was a successful property dealer as well as a physician. Of the 100 or so nurses who spent time at Chelmsford during the 15 years of deep sleep treatment, very few are willing to talk today. Marcia Fordry is an exception.
Dr. Bailey was very adamant in relation to the depth of the sleep that his patients were kept at. He believed that the deeper they were, the more effective the treatment was. So he had the nurses believing that if they didn't keep them deep, they wouldn't get better. You know, it was almost like, it'll be your fault, be it on your head. Start waking up and it doesn't work.
You walk into his office, it's very opulent. There's the fish tank full of tropical fish and the plush carpets. And he wears these sort of fancy brocade jackets. He's quite, you know, expect him to be the sort of debonair type that smokes a cigar. Is very nice and very charming. And a lot of people have fallen for that charm. And of course I was only very young, and I went into his office, and the first thing I saw was a human brain on his desk in formaldehyde or whatever they put it in. And I said, "What's that?" He said, "Oh, that's the brain of a criminal I once operated on."
Harry was very charismatic. He was an academic. He was interested in so many things. He was trying to learn Chinese. He played not a bad flute. He was into electronics. He did all the gimmicky electronic things that he had in his home, like, you know, you clap and the lights go on and all that sort of stuff. He was always into something. He was a man that was forever, ever busy. I considered him then, and I knew him as an absolute genius.
I think a lot of the stuff that he did was experimental, in a sense, even though he had this belief that it worked. I asked him to come and talk to the nurses because I didn't know what to say. And I went to that lecture, and I actually taped that lecture for nurses that weren't able to come. And I mean, he was so convincing. He really did believe in it.
We are in an age now where we've got some very beautiful chemicals that will allow us to produce very stylish results in people's mental function. We never had those in those hard.
But what was the effect of the kind of chemical doses that Bailey favoured?
In my view, there would be very little doubt that they would be very severely sedated, perhaps in extreme point of being unrousable. I think when, say, an hour or so after receiving a very large oral dose of barbiturates, the level in the blood and therefore the level in the brain would build up to the point where they might well be not really asleep, but in quite a deep coma.
Bailey, the showbiz psychiatrist, also had showbiz patients. In the late 60s, one of Australia's most successful TV stars was Bobby Lim.
My wife was doing another television show, and I was home alone, and I was watching my show, actually, on television, and I suddenly felt this great depression and this pain in my tummy, and I felt very depressed, and I just sort of almost ran outside, out in the garden. We had rather a large rose garden, and I laid on my back under the rose garden, under the rose bushes, and a rose petal dropped out of one of the bushes, and that to me was the key. It sent me off, and I just couldn't stop crying and weeping. And anyway, the next day, I was taken off to see Harry Bailey. He told me that he had to stop my mind. In other words, he likened it to a motor car. You have to stop the engine before you can repair it. So he said, I'm going to send your mind on a holiday for about a fortnight. And they call it deep sleep therapy, you see. So I went along. I went to the hospital, and with my wife and my daughter, they saw me into the hospital. And I went into the bed, and then soon after I'd been there, he came in with the matron and wheeling something which he said, "No, it's time for my cocktail." And he turned me over and injected whatever it was. And I went into a very deep sleep, a coma, and there's only just brief snatches of things that I remember over the next 2 weeks. In going to the toilet, when you're in this stage, you've just come to enough, and the nursing sister would take you through to the bathroom, but you couldn't stand up, and I had to slide along the wall. I'll never forget that. Slide along the wall, and in doing that, you had to pass this double door with the main sort of ward of Chelmsford. And I never forget looking in there, because it not only was quite dark, but it smelt, and there were these bodies on the bed, like some rare, some of them not really clothed properly,
Unlike Bailey's star patients, the experience of Pat Lloyd was much more typical of the majority of patients who went into Chelmsford, with few prior health checks, inadequate of the treatment to follow, and consent rarely obtained from them. Pat emigrated from England in 1964 with her husband and 4 children.
When I came, I was very homesick. I felt, well, I wanted to go back as soon as I came. So, of course, that didn't help my husband, who was trying to settle in a job, and I suppose I was nagging. And
Pat became depressed, and she was persuaded to consult Dr. Bailey by her husband.
And then he announced that he was going to sell the unit we were living in. And I kind of panicked about that. And he went out of the room, went next door to the neighbour. And while he was gone, I drank some whiskey, which knocked me out, because when he came back, I was unconscious. And he rang Harry Bailey up. This ambulance turned up with, well, I know Harry Bailey was there. And I was just taken off to Chelmsford, and my husband didn't even know where the hospital was. So that was it. I was gone, and I was gone for 3 weeks. I woke up in this room with there was men there, and about 6 beds, I think. I had no clothes on. And I remember being tied down, I don't like talking about it.
Does it make you angry when you think about it?
Yes, it does. Because it was such it took all your dignity away from you. I'm terribly sorry. Really, but it happens every time. I mean, I should be used to it now, talking about it. But it was just that room. I mean, it was horror, and the fact, they were all moaning and groaning, and I had something down my throat. And it was Listerine, and I remember Listerine and pineapple juice, which you used to get, and I can't stand them now, when I smell them, I hate them. I remember them coming, I think Heron was with him one time. He'd come in the night time with a box, a red box with a red light on it, and give me this thing which was awful. It was very painful. Of course, it all comes clear now, I was getting ECT without anaesthetic.
Where was the pain?
Oh, all over. You were rigid, and lights went on in your head, and you just wanted to scream out. It was fear, too. It was the fear.
ECT, electroconvulsive therapy. 110 volts for 3 seconds through the frontal lobes of the brain.
At Chelmsford, many patients undergoing deep sleep received electric shock treatment daily without their knowledge or consent.
So I distinctly remember not signing for anything in the hospital, and I distinctly remember not giving anything to give shock treatment. It's the last thing. So when I found out that I actually got shock treatment, I felt that I'd actually been, raped.
Disturbed by such reports, an Australian civil liberties group conducted an investigation into the use of ECT at Chelmsford.
Our research was that it wasn't a criminal assault that was occurring, because patients could actually remember having electric shock treatment, undergoing deep sleep treatment. Now, psychiatrists pass that off as being hallucinations. It's all part and parcel of being able to use this thing that the person's mentally ill, so therefore they don't know what's going on. But these people hadn't spoken to each other. They'd never even met each other. And yet time and time again the statements were coming up that they remembered the pain of the electric shock treatment.
It was not only disturbingly easy to get into Chelmsford, but as another patient, he found it could be extremely difficult to get out.
My husband always visited me every day if I was in hospital. He heard gurgling sounds from behind a screen, and Dr. Heron walked out past him. He'd apparently finished giving me electric shock treatment, which my husband didn't know I was having, and he would have stopped it. And anyhow, he poked his head around the screen and found it was me gurgling, and I had blood coming from my mouth and nose. And he was horrified, and Sister rebuked him and said he had no rights to be there. And he said, well, that's your opinion. And he then made his mind up that he wanted me out, and he told them he wanted me to leave. And they said, well, you can't take your wife out unless you've paid the bill. Now, we were very young, and we had already paid out massive money. And he said, I don't have that sort of money. And they said, well, you can't take your wife. He was so distressed that he rang my parents, and for the first and only time in our lives, he asked them could they loan him the money to take me from this dreadful place. So my mum had to get a taxi to the bank, draw the money out, and get a taxi to Chelmsford to give him X amount of pounds. I can't recall the amount now. It was quite a large amount, which they took gleefully, because we found out later that that's really what the bottom line was. And then, once I was paid for, so to speak, I was allowed to leave.
Deep sleep was undoubtedly a cheap option. An investigation of Dr. Bailey's accounts shows that he maintained a healthy bank balance at the expense of his suffering patients.
Dad would often take us down to the beach to collect shells. Jay and I got on fabulously when we were young. He was an 18-year-old kid making a fast buck. He was caught with about 250 LSD tabs on him. The solicitor that my father got, Levi, said, well, this is it. You can either go to jail for 10 years or you can agree to undergo psychiatric treatment. And of course we thought psychiatric treatment was lying on a couch and looking at ink blots, and we're saying, oh, you know, quick, take the psychiatric treatment, anything to stay out of jail.
But Jay ended up having deep sleep treatment.
I walked into his room and I got the shock of my life. Because I'll never forget, he was lying there and he just looked like a skeleton. He'd lost so much weight. His hair had fallen out and his eyes were closed, and yet his eyeballs were bulging out through the eyes and moving, and he just looked terrible. And I ran to him and I put my arms around him. I said, Jay, it's me. And he said, Mish, Mish, and he couldn't open his eyes. He said, is that you? I said, yes, it's me. And he said, sit in front of the cupboards, don't let the monsters get me. He was hallucinating because he was just so full of drugs. When he came out of deep sleep, he was totally addicted to barbiturates, and he used to overdose frequently. And now if at any time Jay wanted more, he just used to go to other doctors. I came in, and right over here, his bed was right here, and he was dead. He was cold. Now, he'd told me he was going to commit suicide. He'd told me 3 weeks before this. And I said, don't, Jay, don't be silly. I mean, you know what it'll do to our parents. And he said, oh, but there's no difference between being alive and being dead. This is the type of thing he was saying by this stage. And I said, don't. Anyway, and I later found out that the night before he'd gone to see his girlfriend and said, well, you won't see me anymore. And then, of course, he did it.
Jay's death was not an isolated case of suicide. At least 24 people committed suicide after receiving deep sleep treatment at Chelmsford. Incredibly, the Chelmsford doctors continue to dispute that there's any connection between the suicides and the treatment. But they cannot so readily dismiss those who actually died inside Chelmsford while undergoing deep sleep. This is the only known film of Dr. Bailey at work in Chelmsford Hospital.
Just lie back. No one's going to hurt you, Margaret. Everything's all right. Won't hurt you. Just try and keep it.
Made in 1970 as part of an anti-drugs film, Bailey was presented as a caring doctor concerned about the health and welfare of young people. Tragically, the reality was very different, for it's now known that of the 1,127 people who received deep sleep treatment at Chelmsford Hospital, hundreds suffered permanent brain damage. For others, the effects were even more damaging. In 1967, Graham Carter and his wife Jane were on holiday celebrating their first wedding anniversary when Graham was injured in a bus accident. Although he recovered physically, Graham continued to get headaches, and in order to make an insurance claim, he was referred by his solicitor to Dr. Harry Bailey.
He was very fit, played sport. He was a plumber, so he was always very active, never sick, and he was just a fine young man. You know, he was only 23. We went to the reception area and they just took a few details. Dr. Bailey wasn't there, but he was to see him later. To my knowledge, there was no form signed, no consent for treatment, and they just said, fine, you know, you leave him here, and there's no visitors allowed for about 10 to 2 weeks. And I was, you know, a little bit amazed at that, and I just said, well, I'll be back to see him soon, and I'll ring you in the morning. And that's where I left Graham. I went to the hospital during the time I thought would be visiting hours, 7 to 8. He was already quite heavily sedated. I guess the alarm bells were starting to ring. So I called Dr. Bailey and told him that I was shocked to see Graham so heavily sedated, that I felt sure that Graham would not have understood that a few days' rest in hospital could possibly mean this sort of treatment, that I'd never seen this treatment, and that I wasn't happy about it and that I wanted it stopped. I went to the hospital the next evening and I found Graham to be more deeply sedated. He was lying flat on his back. His arms were restrained, strapped to the bed, and he had a nasogastric tube in place, indicating to me that he was, their sedation had been increased and that he now did not have a swallow reflex, and that was used to give him his fluids and sustenance. I felt panic, and I went to the desk to find some staff and asked them, why he was like this, what had happened, what was going on with the treatment, that, was the sedation lighter? And they appeared not to know anything about the lightening of the sedation. They couldn't tell me any details, and they suggested that I ring Dr. Bailey again. And due to the late hour of the night, I didn't ring him then. And it was in the early hours of that morning that Dr. Bailey rang me and said that Graham was dead.
Before Graham Carter entered Chelmsford, 8 patients had already died of deep sleep treatment. 5 had died in 1964 alone, and nobody blew the whistle. It was only when Jane went to the police and there was a subsequent coroner's inquiry that the first real chance of stopping the treatment occurred. But although the coroner expressed concern at the level of drugs given to Graham, he failed to refer the case for further action.
I felt angry and frustrated that, given medical evidence at the inquest and the information that came to light, it was evident that there was a lot of doubt and concern surrounding this treatment and Dr. Harry Bailey, and it appeared that nothing was ever investigated or followed up, meaning that more lives were to be lost.
So some happier times.
Yeah, they were the good times then.
They were the good days. That was the official opening of the club, remember?
Yeah.
With the mayor.
Yeah, Worth Club broke, but happy, said the supervisor. Let me get to the funeral. He used to work out in the gym next to the police boys club. I'd get in there with him and muck around with him, lifting up weights and stuff. I'm trying to. Just little things like that. I used to copy things he did. There's certain ways he'd lean against the wall and I'd copy that and
Peter Clark began to suffer from unexplained headaches and bouts of nausea and was referred by his GP to Dr. Bailey. Then, after a particularly bad bout of giddiness, Peter Clark asked his wife to take him back to Bailey.
Now, he really believed in him, like all his other patients did. And he just, begged Mum to take him there. So that's where she took him. I remember my brother and I were in bed. About 10 o'clock, the phone rang. And I heard scream when she picked it up. Dr. Bailey told her over the phone that my father had just died from a massive heart attack. And she screamed. She said, "I don't believe you,
He was a 31-year-old police officer. That tells me that I would anticipate that he was physically fit. He was given quite large doses of barbiturates. And I think the respiratory nature of his death seems to be substantiated by the events on the evening when he received ECT, and shortly afterwards was found to be cyanosed. Cyanosis simply means that the blood has got very much less oxygen in it than it would normally have, and indicates, to my mind, that he would be effectively starved of oxygen, asphyxiating, if you like. But the circumstantial evidence here looks very much as though he had respiratory failure.
Peter Clark's death certificate, authorised by Bailey, makes no mention of respiratory failure or deep sleep treatment. 3 years and 7 deaths later, the death of Miriam Polio, admitted with depression after breaking up with her boyfriend.
Miriam was a very healthy, physically healthy 26-year-old young woman. And when she went under sedation, no one expected any complications. Why would you?
By 1977, there can be no doubt that all the Chelmsford doctors should have known the dangers of infections during deep sleep treatment. Dr. Bailey himself had referred to it in his lecture to the nurses. Yet Miriam Polio died of gangrene of the bowel, a complication that remained undiagnosed by any of the Chelmsford doctors, in spite of the concerns by the nurses.
We'd been sort of told about the other people, they weren't well, they would have killed themselves anyway, or they were on a path of destruction, or they've destroyed their bodies and their hearts gave out, and that sort of thing. But there was no explanation for Miriam. And it was very devastating, and it really caused a lot of problems with the staff. In fact, it was really interesting that sometime after, not long after Miriam's death, John Gill came to me and he said, "We better have another barbecue. We have to increase the staff morale."
6 weeks after Miriam Polio died, Dr. Gill's patient John Adams, a 25-year-old drug addict, died after undergoing a particularly heavy version of the deep sleep regime. Double doses of sodium amytal, methadone, largactil, Tuinol, tranxene and eulactil clearly precipitated his death.
The point really at issue is that with the very large dose of barbiturates and the normal doses of some of these other drugs, there is a risk of very significant interaction. That in fact the pumping action of the heart may fail altogether.
We had invited Professor Smith, an expert in the effects of drug treatment, to give his opinion of the drug regime at Chelmsford.
Those are really my reactions, that these were enormous doses. Even if they were justified, even if there were good clinical evidence that putting patients in this sort of state were associated with relief of their mental symptoms, it would seem to me absolutely indefensible that this form of treatment should be carried on anywhere but somewhere where skilled nursing and skilled medical management could obtain. And for my money, that means for most care unit.
By 1978, there had been 24 deaths at Chelmsford that we now know were directly linked to the treatment. So why was this scandalous situation allowed to continue? One reason is that there was systematic cover-up by Dr. Bailey of the evidence which connected deep sleep treatment and the deaths. Even by the time of the first inquest, Dr. Bailey had already told lies about the deaths of 8 patients, and by 1977, he'd filled in a total of 17 death certificates with false information.
A lot of people accepted what Dr. Bailey in particular told them as the truth without questioning it, partly because of the status they had, and partly because of his knowledge and the force of his personality. He himself was involved in cover-up. There is no doubt that there were death certificates filled in falsely by him. No doubt about that whatsoever.
One of the major puzzles at Chelmsford is why the staff allowed Bailey to act as he did.
Wasn't aware that they didn't die of what Bailey was putting on the medical certificate, because what he put on the medical certificate, he told us is what they died of. And we had to believe that. Except in the case of Miriam, when we could see outward signs that it was something that was very apparent to all of the staff, that she had some abdominal problem. So we wouldn't have worn heart attack on that one.
The treatment was covered up, but even when it was publicised, it seems that nobody wanted to know. Barry Hart's story got front-page coverage in 1975.
The response that article got in the paper was deafening. I got nothing at all. Nobody rang me, no lawyers rang me, no psychiatrists or doctors, no politicians or public servants and saying, what can we do to help you? Just nothing. Yet at that time in 1975, you already had a coroner's inquest, 2 or 3 serious complaints to the Department of Health, what was going on in Chelmsford, and nothing was done.
In the mid-70s, Barry Hart was a lone voice, but by 1978, the state's youngest ever Attorney General reacted to pressure from a campaign by a citizens' rights group about the Chelmsford deaths and decided to take action.
Well, it was a horror story. I'd been presented with 16 cases and suggestion there were a lot more of deaths that seemed to be very much related to the treatment that was being received there. There's long coma therapy, which is a very untried and doubtful medical procedure, electroconvulsive therapy being used with gay abandon, and there didn't seem to be much medical supervision at this private hospital. It was a frightening story where obviously a lot of people had died and could have died in circumstances that there should have been trials of people for serious crimes. So I wrote to the Minister for Health in our government at the time, seeking admission to the hospital.
What happened as a result of your letter?
I received a reply from a colleague which indicated that there was a full investigation to be made into the matter.
Your colleague was the Minister of Health?
Yes, Mr. Kevin Stewart. Kevin was a very amiable, kindly man. He was not the sort of minister to buck his departmental head. He was not an interventionist minister at all. and he would accept the advice he received from his departmental head. That was the nature of the man, and there was no investigation. And like me, he has to take responsibility for that, but I think that the real reason nothing happened was the department was not prepared to move.
So who finally was responsible?
Yes, the head of the department was a man named McEwen. His nickname in the public service was Rocky. He was a very powerful character too, a man from the old style of bureaucrats. My view was that you know, he was responsible for the lack of investigation. He was head of the department. His minister received a letter from an Attorney General and had to be treated at the highest level, and I think responsibility has to rest there.
We've obtained further evidence of the Department of Health's failure to investigate Chelmsford. It's revealed in a confidential report prepared by the department's complaints unit. The report says that despite the Minister of Health advising the Attorney General that a detailed review had been undertaken, no complaints were ever made about any of the matters at Chelmsford, nor is there any evidence of any detailed investigation. The author of the report has agreed to talk to us about her findings.
The complaints about de-sleep demanded a cooperation from a number of departments. No one person seemed to take responsibility for the injection and coordinate the responses or responsibilities. So there was no clarity, there was no coordination. There was a lack of expertise, which clearly led to the lack of coordination because no one knew what they were supposed to be doing or indeed accepted responsibility. Doctors are very reluctant to criticise other doctors. Now here we had a Department of Health which was doctor-led. In those days the Department of Health was mainly administered by doctors at senior levels who had very little management experience, who belonged to the culture of doctors, who believed that this notion of clinical freedom. So that in a way generated the culture that was to exist in the department, and that was doctors were independent. They alone determined treatment. They were not to be questioned by other doctors, let alone the bureaucracy.
Mr. James Rhymes was head of the Department of Health from 1961 to 1973, a period during which patients died at Chelmsford. It was the job of his department to license and inspect private hospitals, a role which failed to uncover the extent of the problems at Chelmsford. But as he solemnly told a government inquiry, his staff did very good measuring for the size of doors and staircases and inspecting food.
It would be very difficult for nurses who were inspectors to visit a private hospital in the 70s and comment about treatment issues.
They had an enormous responsibility to do something about it. They were going in there every year doing checks. They go in there with blinkers on because they just didn't see these people lying unconscious, groaning, moaning, lying in their own faeces. Was the hospital cleaned up that day that they didn't see it? You know, there was a moral responsibility here, not just that the legislation gave them the jurisdiction to do something about it. These people in the health department saw what was going on and took action. And that, we say, is where the moral responsibility for the government rests.
By 1978, there was overwhelming evidence about the dangerous treatment at Chelmsford and that there'd been an unacceptable number of deaths. Dr. Bailey did nothing to stop it. Neither did Dr. Heron, Dr. Gardner, nor Dr. Gill. It took a young psychiatrist who used Chelmsford occasionally for his patients to blow the whistle.
I really had a few doubts about deep sleep, but I had no idea there'd been death. Psychiatrists expect the occasional suicide, and perhaps once in their lifetime, hopefully not, you get a drug death, but to have deaths from any other source is just totally unacceptable. And so I knew we had to do something, or I felt, you know, absolutely compelled to do something to stop it.
Dr. Botcher arranged a meeting at a fellow doctor's house where he and a group of psychiatrist colleagues challenged Dr. Heron about the treatment at Chelmsford.
So by the end of the meeting, Dr. Heron hadn't accepted any of the arguments that you put?
Hadn't impressed him one tiny bit. He had, it had all bounced right off him. He was used to people, as an administrator, he was used to people disagreeing with him, and he felt this was just another little storm in a teacup.
But this storm refused to die down. The owners of Chelmsford heard of the meeting and pushed for the treatment to stop. By early 1979, Dr. Bailey and Dr. Heron had finally and reluctantly abandoned any further attempts at deep sleep treatment at Chelmsford. In 1980, after 7 years of legal battles, Barry Hart successfully sued Dr. Heron for $60,000 for wrongful treatment. And slowly the Chelmsford scandal came under official scrutiny, with Dr. Bailey being charged with the manslaughter of Miriam Podio, a charge that was later dropped, and the reopening of the inquiry into Francis and John Adams. Unsuccessful attempts were made to have the Chelmsford doctors banned from medical practice. Finally, in 1988, the government announced a royal commission to thoroughly investigate the affair. After 2.5 years of deliberations, the commissioner made strong recommendations about the Chelmsford doctors.
The commissioner said about the death of Audrey Francis that Dr. Heron seemed unwilling or unable to accept the overwhelming evidence of the experts that DST was directly linked to and responsible for Miss Francis's death. Then, in relation to the death of John Adams, concerning Dr. Gill, the commissioner said Dr. Gill was totally inexperienced in the application of DST and in the drugs used in the regime. What John Adams amounted to an irresponsible experiment. He was abysmally ignorant of the interaction and potentiation of the drugs he prescribed. He was, in my opinion, grossly negligent in his treatment of John Adams. Dealing with Miriam Podio, who involved the 3 doctors, or actually 4 doctors, Dr. Bailey, Dr. Heron, Dr. Gardner and Dr. Gill, the Royal Commissioner said that Dr. Gardner accepted the responsibility. He then said, Dr. Heron and Dr. Gill had reservations about doing so. Their attitude demands severe criticism. Both were involved in her treatment and were significantly responsible for her death. All 3 were guilty of neglect to the most serious level.
Pretty strong criticisms.
Oh, extremely strong, yes.
In spite of the Royal Commission's findings, 18 months on, Dr. Heron, Dr. Gardner, and Dr. Gill are still working as doctors today. At first, Dr. Heron agreed to be interviewed for this program, but then changed his mind. Dr. Heron told us that he sees himself as a victim of Chelmsford, having suffered from what he describes as a witch hunt. He told us that patients were never in deep coma. They were always rousable. They were never given ECT when awake. I would give an anaesthetic if there was any doubt whatsoever, he said. Dr. Heron argued that the treatment at Chelmsford was very similar to that carried out by Sir William Sargent in England. But Sargent's patients were aroused 3 times a day for meals. At Chelmsford, they were kept so deep they had to be fed through tubes.
Would you like to comment on the deaths that happened at Chelmsford, Dr. Heron?
Dr. Gardner would not be interviewed on camera, but he did agree to talk. He's the only one of the Chelmsford doctors who now accepts that the deep sleep treatment was responsible for deaths at Chelmsford. On ECT, he said, because they were in a coma, I saw no reason to give an anaesthetic. But Dr. Gardner now agrees that with hindsight, it is possible that sometimes patients could have been awake during ECT.
Hello, is that Dr. Gill?
Yeah.
Do you think you made any errors of judgment?
I don't know that I don't think I made significant errors of judgment, put it that way.
Dr. Gill described the Royal Commission as a disgrace. He said the Commissioner's comments on his role in Miriam Podio's death were disgraceful and disgusting. John Adams' death was, he said, an unfortunate accident. Dr. Gill said that the 24 suicides linked with deep sleep therapy were outstanding psychiatric results. And what of Dr. Bailey? As the pressures increased on him over Chelmsford, Bailey's mental health deteriorated. In a bizarre episode in the late 70s, Dr. Heron had Bailey admitted to Chelmsford and given his deep sleep treatment, apparently without Bailey's knowledge. 6 years later, in 1985, on the eve of court action against him by a former patient, Bailey's despair at his predicament had been heightened by a letter from his old hero, Sir William Sargent, to Bailey's lawyer, in which Sargent firmly rejected Bailey's technique of deep sedation and feeding through tubes. It was the same technique that he, Sargent, had abandoned in the 1930s after the deaths of 2 of his patients. Sargent said if I'd come over to Australia to give evidence on oath, I would have found myself supporting the prosecution and not the defence. After learning of Sargent's letter, Bailey drove out of Sydney, parked on a lonely dirt track, and committed suicide with barbiturates and alcohol. In a final note he wrote, "I've had enough. I learned today that they've sent police to London to interview Sargent. Always remember that the forces of evil are greater than the good."
Because we're putting 6 lesions in the brain, 3 on each side. And the people we've been picking for this operation have been really the bottom of the can. Nothing's going to help. Shoot them, anything.